There is just something undeniably aesthetically pleasing about watching athletes who can generate immense force in the blink of an eye. A perfect blend of strength and speed. That snap or twitch, if you will, also known as explosive power production. The terms strength and power are often used interchangeably, but they refer to different concepts. Simply put, strength is the ability to exert maximum force regardless of the time it takes, while power on the other hand is the ability to exert force within a limited time frame, combining strength and speed. Which begs the question, what is the difference between explosive power and just power? The equation of power, force multiplied by velocity, shows that power can come from different combinations of force and speed. Theoretically, this means that you could produce the same hypothetical amount of power by relying more on force, more on speed, or an equal balance of both. For example, when it comes to high force and low velocity, we can think of strongmen or powerlifters who must lift massive amounts of weights, and consequently the velocity will be relatively slow, despite having a high power output. When we think of low force and high velocity, what comes to mind are sprinters or jumpers. The only resistance in this case is the gravity and their own body weight, and therefore they will display very high speed and still a high amount of power. And then we have medium force and medium velocity, relatively speaking. Examples of these athletes are track and field throwers, Olympic weightlifters, basically athletes who use a perfect balance of force and speed. Essentially, just being powerful doesn't necessarily mean that you are explosive. Take a boxer like George Foreman. He was incredibly powerful but not super explosive. Then there is Mike Tyson, who was incredibly powerful but also explosive, because he produced his power from a heavy reliance on speed, or what we would call rate of force development. And that is probably the quality you are looking for, and perhaps why you clicked on this video. It is a synonym for explosive power. And like most other athletic, morphological and even cognitive traits, it is heavily influenced by genetics. Some people simply seem to hit the genetic lottery for explosiveness. Discussing all of the genetic factors is beyond the scope of this work, but let's go through the key ones. First of all, we all have different kinds of muscle fiber type compositions. Our muscles contain both fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers, each with distinct roles. For explosive power production, fast twitch muscle fibers are obviously desirable. Sadly, we cannot change our muscle fiber mix substantially. And then we have neuromuscular efficiency. The brain and the nervous system play an equally critical role by firing muscle groups in rapid, coordinated manners. Genetics set a baseline for how we can develop these pathways, but as we will go into later, with specific training, the speed and the efficiency of those neural signals that connect the brain and muscle can be fine-tuned to support greater explosiveness. And of course, we have tendon stiffness. Tendons store and release elastic energy like springs. The stiffer the tendon is, the higher the stored elastic energy, and some athletes will have a genetic head start on this department. Finally, a detail that is often ignored is leverage. Bone structure, joint angles, limb length, all of the physical mechanics that impact how efficiently force is produced. This is almost entirely genetic, which means that some people are just structurally built for superior power productions in certain contexts and angles. With that being said, there is no reason to get discouraged. While genetics might give some people a head start, targeted training still allows everyone to push their explosive potential. Just as you wouldn't drop out of university because a classmate is better at math, there is no reason to give up explosive power training just because others might have a natural edge. A genetic ceiling does not mean a genetic hindrance. We simply need to focus on the improvable factors, which is the main topic of this video. When people hear the term power development, they often mythologize it, thinking it's something highly complex. But really, it's not that complicated. It simply means displaying strength quickly. To achieve this, you need both strength and speed. And what is the best, most time-tested way to develop strength? Quite simply, compound strength exercises both bilateral and unilateral, with an even balance of all major movement patterns. These include pushing, pulling, squatting, and deadlifting mainly. If you have the time and the energy, depending on your sport, you can also include unilateral variations. However, this isn't mandatory, especially if you're a fan of the Pareto principle. The next step is to have some form of progressive overloading plan. This is a fundamental principle of biology and nature in general. We adapt to the stressors that we experience, both physically and mentally. If you consistently expose your body to the same stressors, it's not gonna change. The same principle applies to strength. To get stronger, you need to lift progressively heavier weights at a pace that challenges you without leading to overtraining. There are countless of ways to implement this in a training program, but we certainly can't cover them all in one video. Generally, however, you can opt for a few comprehensive and longer sessions or more frequent, shorter ones. Each approach has its pros and cons, depending on factors like time availability and personal preference. But if properly sequenced, they can both be equally effective. And then we have the ever-debated question of the optimal rep range per set. We have all seen all of these different rep range charts on the internet that attempts to oversimplify a complex topic. But there isn't a universally applicable rep range for strength, hypertrophy, or anything else for that matter. It is way too contextual. As a rule of thumb, it is not the rep range alone that determines strength gains, but rather the rep range combined with the appropriate intensity. Finally, it is essential that you do strength training or any form of power training for that matter in a non-fatigued state. Power by definition requires high outputs in a short time, and you cannot achieve that if you are fatigued. The importance of this cannot be overstated. So rest as long as you need between sets to ensure that you're in a non-fatigued state. In the 1960s, Soviet scientist Yuri Veroshansky developed what we now call plyometrics. While observing elite performers, he noticed that they could generate more force by making use of the stored elastic energy within their musculature and tendons, which led him to explore the concept of the stretch shortening cycle. The stretch shortening cycle works by a quick transition between eccentric and concentric contraction. Veroshansky discovered that keeping ground contact times short, or the phase between these, will increase utilization of elastic energy and therefore higher power output. And to enhance this phenomenon, he developed a training method originally known as the shock method, which we call plyometrics today, and it became a staple in the Soviet strength and conditioning arsenal. There are many different plyometric exercises in different movement patterns, from simpler ones to more intermediate to more advanced. Perhaps the most characteristic of Veroshansky's studies is the depth jump, which involves standing on a height, jumping down, and using all of that generated elastic energy to jump up again. Now, what if I could use only one universally applicable plyometric exercise? While I'm not particularly fond of this question as it oversimplifies a complex topic, I believe it fits well in this context. You might be thinking about exercises like the depth jump, the hurdle jump, or perhaps even the standing broad jump. While these are excellent alternatives that I would undoubtedly include for most athletes, they are not quite what I have in mind. The most accessible and universally effective plyometric exercise offering substantial benefits is actually sprinting. Although some authors might categorize it separately, sprinting is in fact a plyometric movement. If plyometrics is defined as explosive movements, generally focused on the lower body where muscles generate maximum force quickly using a rapid stretch reflex followed by powerful contraction, then sprinting fits that perfectly. Now, whether you choose to incorporate sprinting, depth jumps, broad jumps or any other variation, the key will be quality over quantity. Once again, I don't like giving set rep ranges, but probably depending on the exercise, this will correspond to anywhere between 3 to 10 repetitions and 20 to 200 meter sprints. I would say trust your gut. If you don't feel like you are exerting as much power as you can within these repetitions, probably do higher reps. If you feel like you are actually exerting tons of power and you are noticeably neuronally fatigued, then stay on the lower rep range. And likewise, rest enough so that you are in a non-fatigued state. And by all means, we cannot talk about explosive power training without mentioning the Olympic weightlifting variations. Olympic weightlifters are some of the most powerful, explosive and twitchy athletes on the planet. Studies have shown that during the second pull, the power generation part that is, they have produced unfathomable amounts of wattage in terms of power. Characteristic for the Olympic lifts are the lift off from the ground, the second pull, which is the most powerful part where you generate the most power, and you have the speed under the bar, a very neglected benefit of implementing these, and the catching phase of absorbing weights, which has been theorized to improve your resiliency. Although these are excellent benefits of implementing the Olympic lifts, it is not actually the greatest benefit in my opinion. The greatest benefit of implementing these exercises is that they incentivize high power output, a very underrated advantage. To finish an Olympic lift, by definition, you have to generate tons of power to catch it in the front rack position in the first place. If you do not generate tons of power, you will miss the lift, you will fail it. So it incentivizes high power output. As opposed to this, if you were to perform a squat jump or a trap bar jump, you simply lift the weight and jump with it. You don't have the same kind of incentive to produce maximal amounts of power because you don't have to catch it. The main caveat here, however, is that they are difficult to master, and especially so if you don't have proper guidance. The most obvious solution is quite simply to get proper guidance. Work under a coach that can teach you the technique. The second point is that you can focus on the simpler variations that give you the highest bang for the buck. You don't need to be performing full snatches, full cleans or squat jerks and things of that nature. A power clean is enough. And if that is too difficult, you can downgrade it into a block power clean, a hang power clean, or in very severe cases, a clean pull. Regarding the optimal number of sets and reps and even the intensity, there is no easy answer. But generally, Olympic lifts are more suitable for intensities above 55% of one repetition maximum, because we want to work on high velocity strength. If you stay below that, plyometrics is a better alternative, because then you deviate into maximal velocity training. As for the repetitions and sets, the Philippines chart is often employed. It is far from perfect, but it is the closest we have come to having a general model to follow that explains the relationship between the optimal numbers of reps per set. This was developed by Soviet weightlifting coaches that analyze countless of athletes and lifts to determine the optimal range. Now, you don't have to follow a rigid and generalized template like this. Basically, common sense would indicate the higher the intensity, the lower the volume, and vice versa. Ballistic training describes exercises that are of projectile or flight nature, as the name suggests, which means that they go beyond the traditional bench presses or back squats that stop at the end. Instead, you would throw them or jump with them. For example, in a standard back squat, as we can see in the graph right here, as we would expect, the velocity would be highest from the start, and then when the athlete has to break at the end, it would naturally flatten out and decline. But in a ballistic variation, also the velocity would be highest at the start, but it would continue for way longer because you don't stop at the end, you jump with the weight, so both the velocity and the bar displacement would go beyond. So with that in mind, some scientific works, they suggest that some sports, they move beyond the traditional ranges of motion as evident in back squats or standard bench presses, and they have to continue because they are ballistic in nature, so they encourage the use of ballistic training. That being said, every tool has its appropriate place and purpose. I would certainly not use ballistic training for maximal strength training, say above intensities of 70% of one repetition maximum. In that case, it would be too dangerous in my view. So standard compound strength exercises are more preferable. But if we are working with high velocity strength or maximal velocity, the area between those two, then ballistic training and Olympic lifts and things of this nature are more appropriate. And for absolute maximal velocity, you could use plyometrics and sprinting and even medicine ball throws. There is an appropriate tool for every purpose. Now, regardless of the power training method that you implement, there is one universal and unbreakable law that you must follow if you want to develop power, and that is quality over quantity. 5 quality reps are better than 10 poor repetitions. And with quality in this case, I am referring to the intensity. You must condense all of your energy and intensity and mental effort into one small moment and finish the repetition. This is known as motor unit recruitment. A signal is sent from the central nervous system, it travels through the spinal cord into the musculature. The stronger this signal is, the more power you will produce. And this is a skill by a large margin, and it is improvable. Some people have a head start in this due to genetics, as we talked about before, but after years of training, of maximal intent training, it can be improved to a substantial extent. So quite literally, explosive power training to a large extent is training your brain. It is training your brain so that you can produce powerful actions at will. If you are not engaging your repetitions of power training with high mental intent, you are just exercising. You are just performing cardio, and you're not training for power. Now, biologically and psychologically speaking, it is a human principle that we prefer the path of least resistance, the principle of least effort, that is. We want the shortcut. We don't like exerting a lot of effort, regardless of which area we're talking about: sports, studies, school, anything, on a general basis. Which begs the question, how can we force ourselves to put maximal effort into each repetition of a power clean, of a plyometric exercise, or a deadlift, for example? And the answer to that is incentives. Put a benchmark, a goal, something that shows you how much effort you exert. If you set a hurdle, for example, at a specific height, you have to finish the exercise, otherwise you will fail and this will hurt your ego, so you have an incentive to exert a lot of effort, compared to if you had not done so. But there is actually one method that I believe is superior to all of these. To give you an extreme example, when strongman Eddie Hall broke the deadlift world record, he imagined his child trapped under the weight. Fantasy is a powerful weapon, and I believe we can all agree that the mind isn't always good at distinguishing between fantasy and reality. So by using your fantasy, you can create a sense of urgency, similar to what Sun Tzu would call the death ground strategy, of burning all of your bridges so that you are forced to fight like never before. The topic of programming is a giant area with multiple entry points, and we cannot discuss all of them in one video. But once again, use every training method for its intended purpose. We have maximal strength training, high velocity strength training, and maximal velocity training. But how are they integrated? First of all, you have to ask yourself these very important questions. What is your sport and what are the demands of your sport? What are your greatest needs from an athletic standpoint? And what is your competency in the different modalities of training? And what is your availability of time for strength and explosive power training? And what season do you find yourself in? All of these will affect the way you program your power training. Once you have determined that, there are two main ways of implementing power training. Number one, train the different attributes such as strength, high velocity strength, and maximum velocity in separate sessions. This can be very time consuming, but there is probably higher quality reps and recoverability. And number two is to combine them in the same session instead of separating them in their own sessions. And this is very time saving and very practical, and it's very suitable for athletes that use explosive power training as a supplement to their own sport. I would recommend this approach for the vast majority of athletes. So if you choose to combine all of it in the same session, you have two alternatives. Number one, you start with the velocity demanding exercises and then you transition into the maximal strength training exercises. Or number two, you combine them into supersets, which would either be characterized as post-potentiation activation or even French contrast. For example, you begin with a squat and immediately after finishing your first set of the squat you go over to a depth jump or any other power training method. Either you do this immediately or you rest a little bit in between, then it would be characterized as French contrast. And this is a very time-saving and efficient method for busy athletes. And of course, we cannot talk about power development without mentioning periodization. Now, people are often terrified by this term, but it's actually very simple. It is taking a grand objective, such as peaking for the national championships, which would be characterized as the macro cycle. Now we have that, let's say there is 1 year leading up to that. Then we would put smaller sub-goals within this broad goal, which would be characterized as the mesocycles, and that could be maximal strength one period, and then high velocity strength another period, and maximal velocity another period. Now keep in mind that this is rarely approached in an extremist way. Just because you are in a maximal strength cycle, it doesn't mean that you neglect velocity training or high velocity training, for example. It simply means that you prioritize maximal strength over the former. A mesocycle could range between multiple weeks to 1 month to multiple months, and this explains why we use the mesocycle. Some people argue that just using a training month is more simple, but some goals they might take longer than a month. And then we have the smaller pieces within these mesocycles, which explain the training weeks, for example, and what we discuss here are the rep ranges, set ranges and things of this nature, and this would be called microcycles. And under these you have your individual training days, exactly what you're gonna do each day.